If you're like me, you hate the state of the current retro game market. It's expensive. Through this series, I've been revisiting games of consoles I grew up with in the hopes of helping you and I make better decisions on what is worth playing, but more importantly, what isn't worth physically owning. Our game of choice today is Starsky and Hutch for the GameCube, Xbox, PlayStation 2, and Game Boy Advance.
Is that it?
Is it worth your time playing, and should you bother physically owning it? Let's go find out. Welcome to Under the Spotlight. Starsky and Hutch is a vehicle combat game that released between July and September in 2003, depending on which console you got it for, that saw its fair share of developers. Mind's Eye Production oversaw the PlayStation 2 release, while Supersonic Software worked on the GameCube and Xbox release, all of which are one and the same and offer no difference in experience. Spellbound Entertainment, on the other hand, got to the kitchen with some salt, pepper, and a bucket of muddy water and somehow managed to design what I consider a legendary port for the Game Boy Advance. You could make the argument that I'm just saying that to bait you into watching the video longer. You'd be right, but I'm also not joking. While the standard version of the game is a unique experience on its own, I think the Game Boy Advance port of Starsky and Hutch is something that went heavily underappreciated at time of release and doesn't see enough appreciation now, and I feel it's due for some time in the spotlight. When the game released back in 2003, you either completely loved it or absolutely hated it, and the reviews seem to reflect that. While the grand majority of user reviews rest somewhere within the borders of a 4 or a 6 out of 10, occasionally you come across a review that absolutely trashes the game, like they just walked in on it cheating on them.
I don't know what to do now.
And other times you'll find someone who praises it as a textbook action racer experience. It's not often I find that this is the case when I look to review a game, especially a title that's looked on more as shovelware than anything with actual promise. 9 times out of 10, I find that the game is either oddly beloved or hated for very specific reasons. Starsky and Hutch has somehow landed itself in still waters, so it's my honor to be the one to disturb the peace. Console version's mid, GBA is goated. The console version, while offering a decently fun experience and general gameplay loop, suffers from blatant repetition that creeps up incredibly quick. The game runs dry of originality before you even finish the first episode, what they call levels in the game, leaving the rest of the game feeling like nothing but tasks of monotony. You could argue that as long as the gameplay is fun enough, repetition wouldn't be so bad to deal with, and I would agree, but paired with how it doesn't ever fully utilize its unique systems, and it also fails to properly represent the series it's aiming to portray, I think this all combines for a good, not great, half-baked experience. The issue begins with the game never fully committing to which version of the characters to portray. The game was developed to create hype around the upcoming cinematic release of the same name, which offers a similar but notably different representation of the two. If they committed to either representing the original series from the 70s or the more comedic representation of the upcoming picture, it would have given the game the added benefit of being able to attach events of the game to something that's just as tangible, and would encourage the player to either explore the show or have them anticipating the upcoming movie, but this isn't the case. If you are familiar with the series, there are tells that do remind you that this game is a part of that world, such as the iconic striped tomato, Starsky's iconic sweater that conveniently never changes the entire duration of the game, or the reprisal of Antonio Fargas as Huggy Bear. Get this! He's the narrator. Why? This is one of my biggest turnoffs with the game. I grew up with Starsky and Hutch, and admittedly, it's one of my all-time favorite shows, so I'm gonna be a bit more particular about details than the grand majority of the game's audience, but I believe it's for good reason. Immersion of a game, especially when built around a pre-existing intellectual property, relies heavily and exclusively on the ability to recreate that world with incredible accuracy. That immersion becomes increasingly difficult when the things that made a franchise stand out are lacking in detail or outright missing as a whole. And I think the choice to have Huggy narrate was made when Antonio agreed to join the project, but amounts to a significant oversight that just damages the overall end-user experience. The game likely takes place within the first season of the show. You can tell this because Starsky only ever wore that sweater in the first season. Huggy, while still an informant at that time, wasn't on good terms with the duo as he was still operating several criminal activities under the table. Huggy also disclosed his displeasure of the two being around on several occasions as it's bad for business, so it's nonsensical for Huggy to be narrating Starsky and Hutch as if telling a bedtime story of fond memories to his grandchildren. It would have served the game far better to have either Starsky or Hutch deliver a more serious take on the narration over Huggy's sometimes near blissful delivery of mission events. I admit it's a detail that's rather nitpicky to point out and probably won't bother the grand majority. And don't get me wrong, Antonio does a great job for what it's worth, and while there are other problems with the game's poor representation, like the actors sounding nothing like Starsky and Hutch.
Doctor was pretty straight about our chances.
Breezy must want Swan almost as much as we do.
Captain Dobie will confirm. Have him call receiving hospital and check on Starsky.
Believe it or not, we gotta save Swan. Hit it!
I think this specific detail takes away enough from the experience to warrant pointing out as a specific shortcoming of the game. And again, it's not going to seem like a big deal to the grand majority of people, but it's not the only place the game is lacking. Gameplay is arguably also not the best part about this game, but it shouldn't be so easily dismissed. I personally like to say that this game leans towards being a rail shooter with a twist, because it very much does feel like one. I often felt at times like I was playing Sin and Punishment Star Successor, the only difference being I couldn't control where Hutch could aim.
So I was going to record some gameplay for a joke. Okay, so it must be an Epic Mickey, right? Yeah, it must be an Epic Mickey. Okay, it must be in the Wind Waker for the totally different. Send help.
You probably laugh at the comparison because the games are nothing alike, but when you break it down, they are. Both of you move around the screen on a specific loop and path, both of you defeat enemies and shoot at targets as you traverse, both have an incredibly underwhelming story that will have you mashing A like you're trying to catch Lugia with a great ball.
It's gonna work.
The game plays out over 3 seasons, or levels, that amount to a total of 18 episodes, or stages, and just as the labels suggest, the game plays out as if you, the player, are filming episodes for the TV show with events of the level appearing in the final cut. As you play through a level, you have to accrue viewer ratings, the game's unique spin on a level timer that you can increase by shooting certain targets, performing a number of driving tricks and maneuvers, or most commonly, shooting at the bad guys. I have to admit, this initially sounded incredibly cool and had me immediately interested, but as soon as I started playing the game, I quickly realized they took this absolutely nowhere. They created this unique system and did absolutely nothing with it. Where you're supposed to be filming episodes, it's odd that what you do in the level has no actual impact on the episode outside of your score. Make an insane jump, take out a bad guy while in midair, do a barrel roll?
Hey, fucks.
Great news! It doesn't matter! Not only do exciting things like rolling a car or getting the bad guy at the last possible second have zero impact on your score, which is an L on its own, they missed a huge opportunity in having an episode recap where a few short clips of live or pre-rendered gameplay display of such events as a final cut of the episode. Instead, you just get brief clip art animations and JPEGs of the characters that are surprisingly accurate when you turn the TV off.
You seeing this? How did they do it?
It makes performing stunts, like rolling a car or driving backwards while shooting and dodging traffic behind you, feel pointless, because they are, and offer no benefit to gameplay outside of entertaining everybody in the room. It also doesn't help that you have little to no control over where Hutch is aiming outside of turning the car to face a specific direction and just hope he aims at what you want him to. Why you can't even swap targets with the right analog or C stick or any other button is beyond me, but further adds to a negative experience, which can often trap you in a horrible loop of failed attempts at certain levels. In some levels, there are targets that you are discouraged to hit, which can sometimes instant fail you if you're not careful. Most of the time you're lucky and only suffer a penalty to your timer, but even then it can be an incredibly harsh punishment for a mechanic that is entirely out of your control. This occurred several times for me, despite efforts to ensure I'm hitting only the target that I need to hit, which is a problem you face very early in the game. How this made it past quality assurance is beyond my understanding, but it's such a small adjustment that if it had have been made, would outright erase frustrating situations that are caused exclusively by the absence of control. And as mentioned before, the worst part about the game is how quickly it becomes repetitive and how quickly the formula becomes brutally clear with every episode you play. Drive around while you shoot at rot-brained AI, or drive around while you protect soup-brained AI, all while shooting at brain-damaged AI, hoping that it all somehow works out that you end up progressing further to the next level, which really keeps your desire to play Starsky and Hutch for longer periods of time at an all-time low. Each episode does include repeat playthrough incentives, but I don't think it's enough to bother giving this game more than a once-over for the majority of everybody watching. Per episode, you have about 4 to 5 bonus objectives, like the ability to find a secret car and collectible Huggy cards, the added difficulty, if you can call it that, of viewer rating goals for a bronze, silver, or gold medal, and a secondary objective to optionally complete. None of them are worth your time. I believe there is a requirement to have a certain amount of medals to unlock seasons 2 and 3, but outside of that, I don't think there's much reason to push any further to obtain more than what's required to play the game to completion. If you do enjoy the gameplay loop enough to want to 100% Starsky and Hutch, it is nice that the extra objectives aren't so far out of reach that they feel like they're solely there to bait you into playing the game far longer than you need to. Most, if not all, can be obtained within 3 to 5 attempts per level, and if you go for the secret car first, I will admit it can be fun driving around in something that isn't Starsky or Hutch's car while you seek to complete the other objectives. So while it isn't at all worth it in my opinion, it's not so bad that you're gonna feel like it was a complete waste of time to do. In the end, it is a nice added incentive to give you more reason to continue playing the game if you so choose. The same can't be said for the version on the Game Boy Advance, because none of what I told you is present in this version of the game. Your only objective is to drive from point A to B, while occasionally having a bad guy to shoot as you do, which serves as the perfect example of absence of extravagance often leading to a fun experience. Simplicity is what benefits Starsky and Hutch on the GBA. While the levels are short, the driving, especially for the Game Boy Advance, is incredibly fun once you get the hang of it. Much like Starsky's driving habits in the show, the Torino drifts and drifts as you turn corners, dodge oncoming traffic, and make your way to the objective. And holy shit, is it fun. It might be off-putting at first because it is a bit much at times, but the driving experience on the GBA port of the game shines a blinding light on those aspects being absent from the parent version of the game, and it's a shame. And even though it reviewed poorly for it in the past, I'm gonna be honest, the length of this game being no more than an afternoon on the couch is another reason the GBA port really stands out. Since the sole objective of the game is to go from A to B, the fun and challenge of the game becomes how quick you are at completing a level, but it's not a required challenge. As long as you reach the objective before your timer runs out, who cares how fast you did it or how you made it to your objective, which further encourages you to explore different route options and just enjoy the time you have playing the game. While you can achieve some level of fun with the parent version, I find it didn't come anywhere near the amount of fun I had playing the GBA port. Where it's a game made for a system with such limited power, it emulates incredibly well, especially on my ROG Ally. It's such a fun experience and I think is worth picking up every time you get the itch to play a 3D racer for the Game Boy Advance. Does that mean you should collect it? GBA, no. Home console, yes. I usually take about 1 to 2 weeks to make a video about a game just so I have enough time to play as much of the game as possible and hopefully buy a physical copy for the video. In that time, I struggled to find a copy of Starsky and Hutch for anything. I lucked out at the last second and happened upon a lone Xbox copy just by happenstance, but the GBA port was absolutely nowhere to be found, and I'm gonna be honest, I'm not not in the mood to pay 3 times the value on eBay just to get it shipped to me. I'd honestly rather give you $10 just to toss it up in the air and hope for the best. But therein lies the problem I see with collecting Starsky and Hutch. If you can't happen upon it locally, it is not worth your time to get. The copy I found in the wild cost me $15, and that to me is a fair price for what you get at a Starsky and Hutch. You really shouldn't spend anything more, because the most you're gonna get out of the game, if you aren't already a fan of the series, is a mediocre vehicle combat game that delivers a half-baked experience that can't decide if it wants to be a Twisted Metal or Grand Theft Auto 3 clone. If you happen upon a copy for less than $20, $15 for the GBA port, I'd say go for it. Otherwise, your money is better spent anywhere else. Starsky and Hutch, while promising and fun at parts, is a stark reminder that reviving old media isn't always as easy as simply digging up the bones. Bye.
I'm so glad this is recording.